Welcome to Nightmare Fuel Stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the stories. The sea was a tomb, and I, Captain Elias Vance, was its keeper. My vessel, the Leviathan's Coil, was older than most grandmothers, her hull groaning with every swell, her timbers steeped in a century of brine and forgotten men. She was a relic, much like myself, an anachronism in an age of steel and satellite navigation. But I preferred the old ways, the feel of the deck beneath my worn boots, the constant conversation of the wind and waves, the stark solitude of a voyage under sail and auxiliary diesel. We were 3 weeks out from port, hauling a load of salvaged machinery that no one else had wanted to touch, bound for a scrap yard in the Philippines. 3 weeks of nothing but gray-green sea, a sky that alternated between indifferent blue and bruised purple, and the rhythmic thrum of the engine, a sound that had long ago woven itself into the fabric of my own heartbeat. It was a lonely life, but a familiar one. My crew numbered a mere handful, all old salts, each with a story etched into their weathered faces, though none as grim as mine. Tonight, however, the solitude felt heavier, a blanket woven from the chill of the ocean and something else, something I couldn't quite name. I stood on the bridge, my hands clasped behind my back, staring out into the inky blackness that swallowed the horizon. The phosphorescence in the wake behind us shimmered like scattered ghosts, and for a moment my mind drifted, as it often did, back to the sea serpent. The sea serpent. The name alone still tasted of salt and ash and bitter, unforgiving guilt. It had been nearly 15 years, but the memory was as fresh as the spray on my face. A sudden, vicious squall, a rogue wave that came out of nowhere, and the snap of the mast like a matchstick. Then the chaos, the screams, the unforgivable cold of the North Atlantic. 6 men lost, 6 good men. My first mate, Silas Blackwood, a man with a laugh that could fill a whole mess hall. Salty Jim O'Malley, the cook, who always had a story and a fresh pot of coffee. Young Tommy Green, barely 18, on his first deep-sea voyage, his eyes full of the kind of wonder the ocean quickly beat out of you. All gone, swallowed by the uncaring depths, and I, Elias Vance, the captain, had been spared. Why, I often wondered, why them and not me? A shiver, not of cold, ran down my spine. The Leviathan's Coil was a solid ship, but she had her own voice. The groans and creaks were a constant symphony, a language I understood better than most men. Tonight, though, there was a new note in the song. A faint, almost imperceptible thump-thump-thump from below deck, not the rhythm of the engine, nor the slap of waves against the hull. This was irregular. I frowned, my brow furrowing beneath the peak of my cap. "What the devil?" I muttered, pushing open the heavy door that led from the bridge to the main deck. The wind whipped at my oilskins, carrying the sharp tang of the sea. I listened again. The sound seemed to be coming from the forward mess, an area that should have been empty at this hour. My crew was either on watch or asleep in their bunks further aft. I made my way carefully along the slick deck, the ship pitching gently beneath my feet. The beam of my flashlight cut a path through the gloom, picking out the corroded steel railings, the stacks of ropes, the coiled lines. As I neared the mess hall door, the sound grew clearer. It was rhythmic, dull, like something heavy being moved. Or like someone chopping, salty Jim. The thought arrived unbidden, unwelcome. Jim was always in the galley, even in the middle of the night, preparing for the next day or just puttering, unable to sleep. "Hello," I called out, my voice raspy against the wind. "Who's in there?" No answer. The chopping continued for another beat, then stopped abruptly. Silence descended, heavy and absolute, broken only by the distant thrum of the engine and the splash of waves. I pushed open the door to the mess hall. The air inside was thick with the faint smell of old grease and stale coffee. My flashlight beam swept across the empty tables, the bolted-down chairs, the grimy galley counter. Nothing. Everything was exactly as it should be, untouched. I stood there for a long moment, listening, my heart thumping a little faster than usual. Had I imagined it, the sea played tricks on your ears, especially when you were alone for so long. Or perhaps it was just the ship settling, the old timbers sighing. I rationalized, as I always did. The mind had a way of finding patterns in randomness, especially when you were getting old. I returned to the bridge, shaking my head. I must be more tired than I thought. I poured myself a mug of black coffee, strong enough to strip paint, and leaned against the console, staring out at the endless black. The incident was quickly relegated to the realm of minor annoyances, a phantom sound born of fatigue. The next morning, the sun rose in a blaze of glory, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples. It promised a calm day, and the sea responded with a gentle swell. I was in my cabin reviewing the ship's log when a faint scratching sound started at my door. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was too light to be the wind, too regular to be the ship. It sounded like someone trying to get my attention with a fingernail or perhaps a small stone. "Come in," I called out, assuming it was one of my crew. The scratching stopped. No one entered. I waited, then called again, louder this time. "Hello, is someone there?" Still nothing. With a sigh, I pushed back from my desk and opened the heavy steel door. The corridor was empty. The dim light from the overhead fixtures cast long, dancing shadows. My eyes swept left, then right. No one. Now this was a little less easy to explain away. I was wide awake, the coffee had kicked in, and the sounds had been distinct. My cabin was located on a quiet part of the deck away from heavy foot traffic. I stepped out, peering into the shadows. Anyone around? I asked the empty corridor. My voice echoed faintly, then I saw it. On the painted steel deck right outside my door, a small circular puddle of water. It couldn't have been more than a foot across, perfectly round and glistening. The deck around it was bone dry. I knelt, touching it. It was cool, fresh, not salty, but it made no sense. There hadn't been any rain, no leaks in the ceiling directly above. It was a completely enclosed part of the ship. My mind immediately, stubbornly, went to the sea serpent. The men pulled from the water, cold and dripping. I shook my head violently. No, not possible. My imagination was playing cruel tricks. I must have spilled something. Water, yes, just water. I found a rag and wiped it up, trying to dismiss the creeping unease that was beginning to coil in my gut. Over the next few days, the incidents became more frequent and less ambiguous. I would be walking past the engine room, and I'd hear a low, familiar whistle one I hadn't heard in years, but instantly recognized as belonging to Silas Blackwood, my old first mate. Silas, who always whistled a jaunty sea shanty when he was checking the engines. I'd stop, listen, and the whistle would fade, replaced by the steady thrum of the machinery. When I looked, the engine room door would be closed, and my current chief engineer, Mac, would be at his station, utterly absorbed, never whistling. One evening during dinner in the mess, a distinct smell wafted through the air. Pipe tobacco. Old, sweet English blend, Silas Blackwood's tobacco. I sniffed, then looked around. My crew and non-smoking lot continued to eat, oblivious. I excused myself, walked around the mess hall, even went into the adjacent galley. No one was smoking. The smell was fleeting but undeniable. Another time I was navigating a particularly choppy patch of water, clinging to the wheel, when I heard a distinct giggle from the deck below. A young, innocent giggle full of awe and excitement. Tommy Green, the sound of a boy seeing the sea for the first time. I turned, my heart hammering, but saw nothing. Only the empty, heaving deck. I started to keep a small, private log, separate from the ship's official record. In it, I meticulously noted each occurrence, each sound, each scent, each fleeting shadow. I was determined to find a rational explanation. The sea was vast, the ship old, the mind fragile. These were the facts I clung to. My crew began to notice my increasing reclusiveness, my jumpiness. My chief engineer, Mac, a stout man with a kind face, once asked if I was all right, if I was sleeping well. "Fine, Mac, just fine," I'd gruffly replied, avoiding his gaze. "Just a touch of the old sea fever, eh?" He'd nodded, but his eyes held a knowing concern. They knew something was off, but they didn't know what, and I couldn't tell them. Not without sounding like a madman. One particularly dense fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, wrapping the Leviathan's coil in a gray shroud. Visibility dropped to mere meters. The foghorn blared at regular intervals, a mournful guttural cry that seemed to amplify the sense of isolation. I was on the bridge, straining my eyes when I saw it, a figure, indistinct through the swirling mist, standing at the bow. It was leaning over the railing, staring out into the fog. The silhouette was unmistakably male, somewhat stocky, and it was wearing a tattered, heavy-gauge oilskin, the same kind Salty Jim used to wear. My breath caught in my throat. My first reaction was anger. Who was out there? It was dangerous, reckless. "Hey," I roared, grabbing the ship's binoculars, though I doubted they'd help in this visibility. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, a silent sentinel. I felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp. I hurried out of the bridge, stumbling slightly on the slick deck. The fog was disorienting, muffling all sound, distorting all perception. "You there, get off the bow." "It's too dangerous," I yelled, my voice swallowed by the mist. I walked faster, my heavy boots thudding on the steel. The figure remained. As I got closer, a strange detail emerged. The oilskin, though heavy, seemed to cling to the figure in places, as if it were sodden heavy with water. And the faint, acrid smell of old cooking oil blended with brine began to permeate the fog. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't right. This wasn't one of my men. My men wore different gear. My men would have responded. I was within 20 feet when the figure slowly, deliberately turned its head. I stopped dead. It was Jim, Salty Jim O'Malley, or a perfect, horrifying facsimile of him. His face was pale, waxy, streaked with what looked like dried salt. His eyes, though, were the worst. They were wide, unfocused, staring blankly ahead, yet somehow I felt their gaze pierce through the fog, through my very soul. Water dripped from the brim of his cap, running down his cheeks like tears. His lips were blue. He didn't speak. He just stared, and then, as quickly as I saw him, he blurred, like a bad film projection. He flickered, the edges of his form dissolving into the swirling white, and then he was gone, vanished. I stood there trembling, the fog swirling around me, cold and indifferent. My mind screamed for a rational explanation, a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was real. I had seen him, Salty Jim, standing on my bow. I stumbled back to the bridge, collapsing into my chair, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The logbook lay open on the console. I picked up my pen, my hand shaking so violently I could barely write. Apparition. Jim Bow, fog, the words were stark insane. The encounters escalated in intensity and frequency. They stopped being just sounds or smells or fleeting glimpses. They became tangible presences, solid and undeniable, even if only for a few dreadful seconds. Silas Blackwood appeared in the engine room, leaning over a piece of machinery, his spectral hands phasing through the steel. He was always dripping wet, his old-fashioned wool sweater dark with saturation. His beard, usually neatly trimmed, was matted and stringy. He'd turn his head slowly, and his eyes, like Jim's, were vacant, yet held an endless depth of something akin to sorrow. He never spoke, but sometimes I'd hear a faint, gurgling sound coming from him, as if he were still drowning. Tommy Green, the boy, was the most heartbreaking. He'd appear on deck, always near the railing, often looking out to sea, his slight frame shivering. He wore the thin canvas jacket he'd had on that awful night. His face was frozen in a rictus of terror, his skin blue-white. Sometimes he'd turn and his eyes, wide with fear, would meet mine, and a silent plea would pass between us. A plea for help, for rescue, for understanding. I would reach out, my hand trembling, but he would always fade, leaving behind only the damp coldness of his passing. I began to question my sanity daily. Was I losing my mind? Had the years at sea, the crushing guilt of the sea serpent, finally broken me? I tried to talk to myself, to reason, to dismiss it. But how could I dismiss what my eyes saw, what my ears heard, what my very skin felt? The cold spots, the smells, the undeniable presences. I stopped eating. I barely slept. The old ship, which had once been my sanctuary, now felt like a prison, haunted by the very ghosts of my past. I avoided my crew, fearing they would see the madness in my eyes. I spent all my time on the bridge, the only place I felt remotely safe, surrounded by the familiar hum of the electronics, the reassuring glow of the radar screen. But even there, they started to appear. One night, as I meticulously charted our course, Silas Blackwood appeared in the doorway of the bridge. He was fully materialized, solid as you or I, but his skin was gray, his eyes sunken, his hair plastered to his skull. Water ran in rivulets down his face, pooling on the deck. He didn't enter, just stood there, filling the doorway with his silent, accusatory presence. "Silas," I whispered, my voice raw with terror and exhaustion. "What do you want?" He just stared, his blue lips slightly parted, as if struggling to speak or to breathe. "I'm sorry," I choked out, tears stinging my eyes. "God, I'm so sorry." His form began to ripple like a reflection in disturbed water. For a fleeting second, his eyes seemed to clear, a spark of the old Silas returning, a flicker of pain, of recognition. He lifted a hand slowly, ponderously, and pointed a skeletal finger at something beyond me. Then he dissolved, leaving behind a puddle of seawater that quickly soaked into the deck, leaving a faint, briny stain. I turned, my heart hammering. What had he been pointing at? The compass, the radar, the chart table? My eyes scanned the bridge frantically. Nothing. He had just pointed vaguely outward, towards the open sea, towards our destination, or perhaps towards his destination. The ship, the Leviathan's coil, began to feel different. The usual creaks and groans transformed into whispers, into moans. The very planks beneath my feet seemed to sag, the bulkheads to sweat. Every shadow held a potential apparition. Every clang of loose rigging sounded like a distant sob. I found myself talking to them. "Are you here, Jim, Silas, Tommy?" I'd whisper into the empty air of my cabin or the deserted mess. Sometimes I imagined I heard a response, a faint echo of my own name carried on the wind. I was spiraling, I knew it, but the evidence of their presence was too overwhelming. I was trapped not just on this ship, but in a living nightmare, reliving the past, haunted by the very men I had failed. One particularly rough night, the ship was battered by a severe gale. The wind shrieked through the rigging, tearing at the canvas covers, and the waves crashed over the bow, sending spray high above the bridge. The Leviathan's coil groaned, pitched, and rolled, struggling against the onslaught. I was alone on the bridge, clutching the wheel, my knuckles white, fighting to keep her on course. My crew was below, trying to secure whatever they could, strapped into their bunks or clinging to handholds. Through the spray-lashed windows, I saw them. All three. Silas Blackwood standing at the bow, his heavy oilskins flapping in the gale, water streaming from his face as if he were being endlessly submerged. He was pointing, not towards the horizon, but down, into the churning gray-green maw of the ocean directly ahead. Salty Jim, his portly form hunched over the forward railing, clutching it with spectral hands. His head was turned and his wide, unseeing eyes were fixed on me, a look of profound despair on his waxy face. He was coughing, a wet, rattling sound that seemed to cut through the roar of the storm. And little Tommy Green, clinging precariously to the mast, his slight body swaying with the ship's violent movements. His youthful face was contorted in pure terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. Water streamed from his hair, from his eyelashes. They were together, recreating the horror, pulling me back to that moment, that awful storm. "No," I screamed, my voice ripped from my throat by the wind. "Not again. I won't let it happen again." I fought the wheel, trying to steer away from whatever horror they were pointing towards, but the ship seemed unresponsive, heavy, as if dragged by an unseen current, or perhaps by unseen hands. The compass needle began to spin wildly, useless. The radar screen flickered, then went blank. All the electronics seemed to short out, overwhelmed by the supernatural presence or perhaps by my own unraveling mind. The ship bucked, a massive wave crashing over the bow, drenching the entire forward deck. When the water receded, they were gone. But then Silas appeared directly in front of me, inside the bridge, closer than he had ever been. He was dripping, his eyes fixed on mine, and his blue lips began to move. Come, he gurgled, his voice a horrifying rasp of water and air like stones scraping at the bottom of the ocean. Come with us, Captain. It's time. His hand, cold and translucent, reached out, hovering inches from my face. I could feel the chill radiating from it, seeping into my very bones. No, I cried, recoiling, pressing myself against the helm, trapped. I won't. I failed you once, I won't again. But my words were futile. He was not asking, he was commanding. Then Jim appeared to my left, his face close, smelling of brine and something vaguely metallic like old blood. And Tommy on my right, his innocent eyes now full of a chilling emptiness, a silent plea that had curdled into something far more sinister. They surrounded me, their forms shimmering, their dampness permeating the small space of the bridge. I could feel their collective chill, hear their combined gurgling breaths, the whispers of the dying. They were pulling me not physically, but with an immense, unseen gravitational force, drawing me into their cold, drowned world. My grip on the wheel slackened. My strength, my will deserted me. The guilt, the grief, the fear all coalesced into a crushing weight, heavier than any anchor. I saw it then, the truth laid bare. They weren't here for vengeance, not truly. They were here for company, to drag me down, to share their endless, solitary torment in the dark, cold depths. Join us, Elias, Silas rasped, his voice gaining a horrifying clarity. The ocean wants her due. Your time has come. The ship gave a massive lurch, not from the waves, but from deep within, a shudder that ran through her entire hull. The floor beneath my feet seemed to tilt unnaturally. I closed my eyes, a single tear escaping, mixing with the sweat on my cheek. I had nowhere left to run. When I opened them again, the storm outside had abated. The sea was calmer, the wind a gentle breeze, the ghosts were gone. The bridge was empty, the compass was steady, the radar blipping reassuringly. Everything was as it should be, except for me. I felt different, lighter yet heavier. My skin was cold, clammy, my clothes somehow were damp. I looked down at my hands. They were pale, wrinkled, the nails blue. My reflection in the dark glass of the bridge window showed a gaunt, hollow-eyed man, his face a ghostly white. I tried to speak, but only a wet gurgle escaped my lips. I stumbled to the door of the bridge and opened it. The sun was rising, painting the sea in hues of pink and gold. It was a beautiful, peaceful morning. And there on the bow stood my crew, Mac and the others. They were staring out at the horizon, their backs to me, their shoulders slumped. They looked like statues, they wore tattered oilskins. I saw then the large, circular puddle of water at their feet, and the faint, familiar smell of old pipe tobacco, cooking grease and young, innocent terror. My name echoed on the wind, a faint whisper from the depths. I stepped out onto the deck, the cold, salt air stinging my already numb skin. I walked towards them, my feet light, barely touching the deck. I knew where I belonged now, I knew my place. The Leviathan's coil continued her lonely voyage, a ghost ship sailing an empty sea, her hull groaning with the weight of her living and her dead, all bound for an unknown shore. I reached the bow, joining my men, my family. I leaned over the railing, staring out into the endless, indifferent blue, and waited.